Welcome, curious minds, to another deep dive. Today we're exploring something truly profound, something that touches every single one of us. How we experience and, well, perhaps even transform suffering.
The big topic.
Huge. Suffering is, unfortunately, it feels like a universal constant. Whether it's from external things like violence, systemic issues, or really personal tragedies.
Absolutely. Those are very real.
But then there's also that suffering we kind of impose on ourselves,
Yeah.
right? The self-blame, the constant worry, the fear. It takes a massive toll.
It really does.
So here's the question, maybe a surprising one.
Mm.
What if a significant portion of that suffering is, well, maybe optional?
It's a really arresting thought, isn't it? And that's the core premise we're diving into today. The idea that while misfortune, bad things happening, that's unavoidable, right? That's life.
Right.
But the suffering that often comes with it, that might be much more a product of our own minds.
Okay.
So our mission here is to explore how changing our inner experience, not just trying to fix everything outside, could lead to really profound shifts.
And we're drawing on some fascinating material today, blending ancient wisdom with the latest neuroscience.
Exactly. Insights from Then I Am, Myself, the World, which offers a really powerful lens on all this.
Okay, so let's start unpacking this idea of optional suffering. Where do we even begin? Maybe with some of that ancient wisdom.
Yeah, a great place to start is Stoicism. This goes way back, thousands of years.
Right, Greco-Roman philosophy.
Precisely, even older than Christianity. And it was supremely rational for its time, rejecting superstitions, focusing on natural explanations.
And its core teaching relates directly to this suffering idea.
Absolutely. The core teaching is powerful. Look, we have pretty limited control over external events. A pandemic, a war, even personal things like a child's addiction or a cancer diagnosis. We can't always stop those things from happening.
Right, that seems obvious.
But, and this is the key insight, we do have the potential, maybe even the full potential, to control our response to those events.
Ah, okay. So not the event, but how we react, how we interpret it.
Exactly. How we interpret it, how we judge it. That's where our power really lies, according to the Stoics.
It's a huge shift in perspective right there.
Yeah.
So if we can control our response, what's the ultimate goal? What does that mastery look like in Stoicism?
Well, the goal was this lifelong cultivation of fortitude and a real deep sense of inner calm. The ancient Greeks had a word for it, ataraxia.
Ataraxia, I've heard that. Imperturbability, freedom from distress.
Yes, exactly. Freedom from distress and worry, achieved by suspending judgment about events being good or bad. Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor.
Meditations, right, his diary.
Yeah, not even meant for anyone else to read. He wrote, "If thou art pained by any external thing, it is not this that disturbs thee, but thy own judgment about it. And it is in thy power to wipe out this judgment now."
Wow, so direct.
It really highlights this crucial insight. Our mind isn't just passively receiving information. It's an active shaper of our perceptions, our emotions, our thoughts.
So the same thing can happen to two people, but their experience is totally different based on their judgment.
Precisely. One finds well-being, the other deep suffering. Think about a common phrase like no pain, no gain.
Okay, yeah.
That's a basic form of reframing, isn't it? You take something unpleasant, like muscle soreness, and you actively choose to see it as beneficial.
Right, necessary for growth.
And this idea extends even to really serious suffering, seeing it as character building or maybe spiritually transformative.
And this mental reframing isn't just wishful thinking. It has real effects.
Oh, absolutely. It powerfully influences our bodily and mental reactions. Just look at the strength of the placebo and nocebo responses. Belief alone can create very real physiological changes.
That's fascinating, how much our internal story shapes reality. But okay, what happens when that kind of mental control feels, well, impossible or just not enough?
Right, and this is where things get really interesting, moving beyond just mindset shifts.
Yeah.
We start talking about what are called transformative experiences. Things like, profound religious visions, mystical states, even overwhelming aesthetic experiences with art or nature or near-death experiences.
Okay, so these big, life-altering moments, what makes them so compelling? Why do they stick with people?
What's key here is that these experiences are often so incredibly profound, sometimes just overwhelmingly blissful, that they almost force the person to reevaluate everything, their life, their beliefs, what they thought was important.
How so? What changes?
Our sources describe it as re-enchanting the world. It happens because these experiences often involve escaping what's called the gravitational pull of the self or the ego. That constant internal chatter quiets down.
Interesting. Escaping the ego. And when that happens, what kind of perspective shift do people report? What fills that space?
Well, when the ego sort of steps aside, things like chasing material goods or status can suddenly seem, well, almost trivial. Herman S. in Siddhartha called it a game for children.
Huh. So less focus on the self and more on.
More on connection. People often describe developing this deep empathy for all conscious beings, sometimes for all of creation, a profound gratitude just for existence itself.
And compassion, too.
Yes, huge compassion for all suffering creatures, and importantly, including for oneself. It can even lead to releasing old guilt or shame. You know that adage, forgiveness is giving up hope of a better past.
Wow, yeah. That fits perfectly.
It really does. Now, historically, these kinds of big transformative experiences often seem to strike randomly out of the blue.
Right, like lightning. You couldn't plan for them.
Exactly. And that randomness leads us directly to the modern quest. How can we make these potentially beneficial experiences more reliable and safer?
And that's where psychedelics come into the conversation.
That, for many researchers today, is precisely where they enter the picture.
Quite a jump from ancient Stoics to modern chemistry. So how did we get here? How did these substances move from the fringe to being seriously discussed for healing potential?
Well, the human interest in changing consciousness isn't new, of course. You had substances like opium, hashish, cocaine fascinating people centuries ago. But the mid-20th century really saw two converging events that changed everything. First, Albert Hofmann, the Swiss chemist. He synthesized LSD back in 1938, but then his famous accidental ingestion and subsequent intentional bicycle day trip on April 19th, 1943. That was the first documented acid trip.
Bicycle day, right.
And the second event, that came later in 1957. Life magazine published a big photo essay by R. Gordon Wasson called Seeking the Magic Mushroom.
Oh, I think I've heard of that one.
It detailed his experience participating in a Mazatec mushroom ritual in Oaxaca, Mexico, with the healer Maria Sabina. It basically went viral, introducing these traditional ritualistic uses to a massive Western audience.
And around the same time, Aldous Huxley published The Doors of Perception, didn't he? About his mescaline experiences.
Exactly. Huxley really lent this intellectual legitimacy to the idea that these substances could provide mystical insights. So you had that, plus suddenly LSD was relatively easy to get hold of.
And boom, the 1960s counterculture embraced it. Timothy Leary, turn on, tune in, drop out.
Right. A rejection of mainstream bourgeois values fueled in part by these experiences.
But that kind of revolution inevitably provokes a reaction, doesn't it?
Absolutely predictable, an equal and opposite reaction. In the U.S., Congress passed the Controlled Substances Act in 1970.
Which put psychedelics in Schedule 1.
The most restrictive category, yeah. Alongside drugs deemed to have high abuse potential and no accepted medical use, effectively slammed the brakes on almost all scientific investigation. And many other countries followed suit.
So research just stopped.
It was driven underground, mostly. But a few dedicated, intrepid scientists quietly kept working under very difficult conditions. And they started demonstrating that actually in controlled settings, these substances are comparatively safe and non-habit forming.
Interesting. So the groundwork was still being laid quietly.
Yes. And that quiet persistence eventually blossomed into what we're seeing now in the 21st century, a genuine renaissance in psychedelic research.
What sparked that renaissance?
A growing recognition, really, that these substances might be able to help with a whole range of psychiatric disorders where our conventional drugs, well, they often have questionable effectiveness and undeniable side effects for many people.
Right. So it's crucial here to make a distinction, isn't it? We often hear drugs used as this big umbrella term.
Absolutely vital. Lumping any mind-altering substance into one category of drugs is just far too simplistic. It's misleading.
Can you explain why that comparison, say with opioids, is often inaccurate?
Yeah, definitely. Psychedelics like psilocybin or LSD are chemically very different from highly addictive and tragically deadly drugs like opioids, things like heroin, fentanyl, even prescription painkillers when misused, or stimulants like cocaine.
They work differently in the brain.
Completely different mechanisms. Psychedelics don't typically target the dopamine system in the same way that addictive drugs do. Each class of molecule really needs to be understood on its own terms, just like we differentiate alcohol, nicotine, and caffeine. They all alter the mind, but in vastly different ways with different risk profiles.
And the context of use matters hugely too, right?
Massively. Taking something like psilocybin in a controlled clinical setting or a traditional shamanistic context with therapeutic intent, that's radically different from recreational use by someone, say, at a party without support or preparation.
That's a really critical point. So what does this modern renaissance look like now? Where is the research focused?
Well, psychedelics are definitely back in the mainstream conversation. You see huge conferences, documentaries on Netflix, ballot initiatives in places like Colorado and Oregon aiming to decriminalize or legalize therapeutic access.
And Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind, really brought it to a wide audience.
It absolutely did. Kind of the modern doors of perception in terms of impact. Right now, psilocybin, the compound in magic mushrooms, is probably the best studied.
And what are the findings with psilocybin?
Some are pretty remarkable. Studies show that just 1 or 2 sessions of psilocybin-assisted therapy can lead to significant improvements in depression and overall well-being that last for months, even longer in some cases.
Months.
Yeah.
From 1 or 2 sessions.
Yeah. And another striking study involved patients with life-threatening cancer diagnoses. A single high dose of psilocybin led to large decreases in their depression, anxiety, and general mood disturbance.
Wow.
And at the same time, increases in their reported quality of life, sense of meaning, and even acceptance of death.
That's profound. Is there any link between the type of experience and the outcome?
Yes, and this is crucial. Patients who reported having full-blown mystical experiences during their sessions were significantly more likely to experience these lasting benefits.
So that subjective experience seems really important.
It certainly appears to be. Compare this to conventional approaches. Psychotherapy often takes years, outcomes can be uncertain, standard psychiatric meds often need to be taken daily, indefinitely, and come with side effects.
Right.
One head-to-head trial, for instance, found psilocybin was at least as effective as a common antidepressant, escitalopram, and seemed particularly good at reducing that kind of stuck negative rumination people with depression often experience.
So this really speaks to that idea of suffering being potentially mutable, changeable through these internal shifts.
It strongly suggests that, yes, that even deep-seated patterns of suffering might not be fixed, that they can be significantly altered by these profound changes in inner experience.
Who's leading the charge in terms of getting these approved?
You have key nonprofit players like MAPS, which is now a public benefit corporation called Lykos Therapeutics, doing the final stages of trials for MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD. And the USONA Institute is focused on psilocybin for major depressive disorder. They're working hard to navigate the regulatory pathways.
But it's not just nonprofits anymore, is it?
No, absolutely not. There's definitely a gold rush mentality emerging now. A whole ecosystem of companies is springing up.
Which brings challenges, like patents.
Exactly. Classic psychedelics are natural compounds, hard to patent. So some companies are trying to develop slightly modified versions or focusing on shortening the experience to make it cheaper and fit better into current healthcare models.
Which might compromise the therapeutic depth.
That's a real concern for many in the field. Does a shorter trip allow for the same depth of processing and insight? We don't know yet.
But the range of conditions being studied is broad.
Incredibly broad. Beyond PTSD and depression, there are trials looking at addiction to alcohol, smoking OCD, chronic pain, anxiety related to end of life, even things like concussion recovery and migraines.
So we might see FDA or European approvals soon.
It seems likely for MDMA for PTSD and psilocybin for depression within the next couple of years. And that could open the door for wider legal access, maybe even off-label use for other conditions down the line.
With all this potential, the next obvious question is about safety. Let's tackle the risks head on. How do psychedelics stack up against other substances people commonly use?
Right, it's a crucial question, and the data suggests that compared to many legal and illegal psychoactive substances, especially something like alcohol, the classic psychedelics are actually far less risky physiologically.
Less risky how?
Their direct physical toxicity is very low. They generally don't cause organ damage. The risk of a lethal overdose from psilocybin or LSD alone is extremely small, almost negligible in practice.
And addiction. That's a major concern with many substances.
That's another key difference. Classic psychedelics are considered non-addictive. They don't hijack the brain's dopamine reward system in the way that drugs like opioids, cocaine, or nicotine do. They typically don't create cravings.
You don't see psychedelic drug cartels.
You really don't. And another interesting aspect is the lack of motor impairment during the experience or a physical hangover afterward. Many people report feeling unusually clear, even buoyant, the day after.
Is there any common physical side effect?
Sometimes nausea or purging can happen, especially when taken orally, usually early in the experience, but it's generally transient.
Okay, so the direct physical risks seem relatively low. What about the psychological risks? The bad trip people hear about.
That is the primary risk for most people, yes. A bad trip can involve revisiting past traumas, intense feelings of despair or fear or paranoia. It can be deeply unpleasant, even terrifying.
Can that be prevented?
It can be significantly minimized, but perhaps not entirely eliminated, by paying close attention to what researchers call set and setting.
Set and setting, mindset and environment.
Exactly. Set is your internal state, your mindset, expectations, intentions. You shouldn't take these substances if you're feeling unstable, highly anxious, or, right after a major argument. Setting is the physical and social environment it needs to feel safe, comfortable, and supportive.
So taking them in a chaotic or unsafe place is a bad idea.
A very bad idea. Rarer but more serious risks exist too, like the potential to trigger prolonged psychosis in individuals who are already predisposed to conditions like schizophrenia.
Are there safeguards for that?
Absolutely crucial safeguards. This includes only giving these substances to adults, carefully screening potential participants for any personal or family history of psychosis, and, ideally, having a trained therapist or guide present before, during, and after the experience.
What about for potential home use if things become more accessible?
The recommendation is always to have a trusted, sober trip sitter present, someone who can offer reassurance if things get difficult, and just be a calm presence.
And navigating difficult emotions during the experience.
The advice is generally not to fight them. Psychedelics can be sensitive amplifiers of repressed thoughts, fears, and desires. Trying to suppress difficult feelings often makes it worse. The goal is usually to allow them, observe them, and let them pass through.
Which sounds easier said than done.
It definitely can be. That's why preparation beforehand and integration support afterward, making sense of the experience, are considered so vital to the therapeutic process.
We've talked a lot about the effects, the experiences. But for the curious listener, what's actually happening in the brain? How do these chemicals cause such profound shifts?
Yeah, let's dive into the neuroscience a bit. Chemically, many classic psychedelics, like psilocybin and DMT, are structurally similar to serotonin. Serotonin is a really important neurotransmitter, a chemical messenger in the brain.
So they fit into the brain's serotonin system.
Exactly. They bind to various serotonin receptors, which are like docking stations on brain cells. These receptors, called 5-HT receptors, are found all over, but especially in areas like the neocortex, the brain's outer layer involved in higher thinking.
Is there one specific receptor that's key?
It seems so. Binding to one particular type, the 5-HT2A receptor appears necessary to evoke hallucinations, mystical experiences, and therapeutic benefits. That receptor seems critical.
And what does activating that receptor do to brain activity?
It's complex, and we're still figuring it out, but neuroimaging studies show a few key things. Psychedelics seem to destabilize the brain's normal long-range communication patterns. And interestingly, they actually reduce activity in certain core regions.
Reduce activity. That seems counterintuitive for such intense experiences.
It does, doesn't it? But the reduction is specifically in midline structures, like the posterior cingulate cortex and the precuneus. These areas are heavily involved in our sense of self, our ego, that internal narrative.
Ah, so less activity there might correlate with that feeling of ego dissolution.
Precisely. That reduction in midline self-network activity seems directly linked to the reported feelings of oceanic boundlessness or cosmic unity, that sense of merging with something larger than oneself.
Anything else happening electrically?
There's also some evidence for a slight increase in the complexity or entropy of brain signals measured by EEG or MEG, but the exact mechanisms and significance are still being worked out. Honestly, it's early days yet in fully understanding the complex cellular and network effects.
And linking brain scans in animals or humans back to the richness of the subjective experience.
Yeah.
That's still a big challenge.
A huge challenge. We can see correlations, but understanding the causal links between neural activity and conscious experience is one of the biggest questions in neuroscience generally.
Which leads us beautifully into this really interesting debate within the field. Is the conscious experience itself, the trip, the visions, the emotions, actually necessary for the healing?
Right. Could you get the therapeutic benefits, like reduced depression, even if you didn't consciously experience or remember the psychedelic journey?
What's the argument for no, the experience isn't needed?
That's often called the dyed-in-the-wool physicalist perspective. It basically argues that only the physical stuff matters. the molecule binding to the receptor, the downstream signaling cascades inside the neuron, the changes in connectivity or neuroplasticity.
So consciousness is just a side effect.
In that view, yes, an epiphenomenon, something that happens alongside the important brain changes but doesn't cause them. It's causally impotent, as they say.
So if that view is right, you could give the drug during sleep or under anesthesia.
Or maybe with an amnesia-inducing sedative, exactly, and you'd still get the therapeutic brain changes. This perspective also, conveniently perhaps, justifies the development of new drugs that don't cause hallucinations and ego dissolution.
Ah, the psychedelic effects without the psychedelics idea, which might be less scary for some people and also patentable.
Correct, on both counts. Developing a non-hallucinogenic compound that still hits the 5-HT2A receptor and promotes neuroplasticity is a major goal for some pharmaceutical companies.
But our source material pushes back strongly against this, calling it a fool's game, right? What's the counter-argument?
Yes, the counter-argument points to the evidence we discussed earlier. The likelihood of long-term therapeutic gains increases with the likelihood of the subject having a mystical experience.
So subjectivity seems critical.
It strongly suggests a critical role for subjectivity. The argument is that the sheer high emotional impact of the memories from these often incredibly vivid and meaningful experiences is the primary source of inspiration for sustaining changes in behavior and outlook long after the drug has worn off.
It's the insight gained, the perspective shift remembered, that drives the change.
That's the idea. It pushes back against this notion that we can just pop a pill for complex mental conditions without deeply engaging with the sufferer's actual lived experience and the meaning they make of it.
Fascinating debate. So looking forward, what are the big unanswered questions researchers are wrestling with as this field explodes?
Oh, there's so many open questions still. For conditions like long-term depression or PTSD, how often would someone need these sessions for lasting relief? Is it one and done? Yearly boosters? We don't know.
Are there downsides to chronic use?
That's another big unknown. We also need to better understand the importance of the therapist-patient relationship. How much does that rapport influence outcomes?
And which conditions are truly best suited for this?
Exactly. Which psychiatric conditions are genuinely amenable and which might not be? Can we predict who will benefit most based on psychological traits or even genetics?
What about the nature of the experience itself? Does it matter if it's blissful versus challenging?
Great question. The role of emotional intensity, whether the experience feels positive or negative, valence, and even the duration, does a longer trip mean better outcomes? These are all under investigation.
And the neuroplasticity, is it happening everywhere in the brain?
Or is it targeted to specific regions? If it is a more general brain-wide effect, that opens up huge possibilities. Could it help treat neurological conditions beyond psychiatry? Things like mild cognitive impairment, the precursor to Alzheimer's, or help with rehab after a stroke? Maybe even disorders of consciousness? The potential applications could be vast if the neuroplasticity effects are broad and controllable.
And one final challenge you mentioned, the hype.
Yes, the media's often breathless reporting builds huge expectations. And we know belief and expectation, the placebo effect, are incredibly powerful, especially in mental health.
Which makes rigorous research hard. Blinding trials.
Extremely difficult. How do you conduct a truly blind trial when the effects of a psychedelic are so profound and obvious compared to a placebo? It's a major methodological hurdle the field is grappling with.
This leads us to another really profound gift that our sources highlight from these transformative experiences. The idea of expanding our perception box. Can you unpack that metaphor for us?
Yeah, it's a powerful metaphor. Think of your perception box as the mental framework, the architecture you inhabit, built from all your past experiences, your culture, your beliefs. And inherently, it limits what you can perceive and understand.
So none of us sees reality as it is.
No one has privileged access to some objective, unvarnished, true reality. What we perceive, what feels real to us, is ultimately a construct of the brain shaped by our implicit and explicit expectations.
You see this play out all the time, right? Especially in politics or social issues.
Absolutely. People can look at the exact same set of facts around something like Black Lives Matter or January 6th or gun control and come to fundamentally different, often completely opposing conclusions.
And we tend to believe our interpretation is the right one.
We often deeply believe we know that we are right, and others are at best misled fools. That's the perception box at work.
And the walls of this box, being made of our actual neural circuits, they're pretty solid. Shatterproof, as the source puts it.
Yeah, you can't just decide to step outside your brain's wiring. But And this is the hopeful part. The good news is we can rearrange and expand the walls by
Oh.
changing the underlying neural connectivity, by fostering neuroplasticity. There are even organizations now like the Tiny Blue Dot Foundation mentioned in the source, specifically funding neuroscience research into interventions designed to do just that, to help expand people's perception boxes.
That sounds like fundamental change. How does it compare to traditional ways of changing perspective, like education?
While traditional education or daily practices like the mental flossing mentioned, breathing exercises, meditation, gratitude journaling, these things absolutely work. They can slowly, gradually expand our box.
But it can be slow and arduous, especially as we get older.
Yes, brains tend to become less flexible, more rigid in their patterns with age. Deeply entrenched attitudes can be very hard to shift through purely rational argument or incremental practice alone.
And this is where transformative experiences offer a different path.
They offer a potentially seductive alternative,
Yeah.
precisely because they can be much more rapid, more dramatic, possibly more effective, at least in the short term, than years of traditional learning for inducing a fundamental perspective shift.
So this isn't just about psychedelics again. What other methods fit here?
No, it's broader. This category includes things like deep trance states, hypnosis, certain types of intensive breath work, dedicated yoga and meditation practices, non-invasive brain stimulation tools alongside psychedelics.
Lots of potential avenues.
Lots. And as the source concludes on this point, time will tell which of these interventions most reliably, consistently, over the longest term, and in the greatest number of people expands their perception box. We're still learning.
But ultimately, the impact of these experiences, whether spontaneous or induced, seems profound.
It really does. They serve as this powerful reminder, often, of the miracle of existence itself. That feeling of awe, that confrontation with the fundamental mystery of why there should be something rather than nothing.
And that leaves a lasting impression.
Often, yes, a feeling of the sublime, maybe a glow that accompanies us in daily life, even after the peak experience fades, a changed baseline. But it's important to add that glow can fade. You know, after you've had this incredible experience, maybe you felt merged with the universe, coming back to paying bills and doing laundry can be jarring.
Right, the mundane reality kicks back in.
Exactly. And that's why maintaining a daily routine, practices like meditation or mindfulness, remains essential, as our source puts it, to maintaining the right attitude throughout one's life. The peak experience can open the door, but daily practice helps you keep walking the path.
Which brings us perhaps to a final, really provocative thought to leave our listeners with.
Go on.
What about the final transformative experience? What happens when the physical substrate, the brain, the body, without which, as far as we know, there can be no consciousness? What happens when that breaks down, becomes inoperable at death?
That is the ultimate question, isn't it? A profound mystery to ponder.
Indeed. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive today. We've journeyed through suffering, transformation, ancient wisdom, cutting-edge neuroscience, and the very nature of our inner experience.
And thank you, listeners, for your curiosity and your willingness to explore these deep, sometimes challenging concepts with us. Keep asking those big questions.
Keep exploring your own understanding of the world. Until next time, farewell.